TCI is brought to you by Grade 1 winner Shaking It Up. Standing at Spendthrift Farm, his first 2-year-olds are selling for up to $400,000.
Welcome back to TCI, your inside track to the Triple Crown. Alongside Joel Cunningham, I'm John Siegel. Well, Joel justified his favoritism, wins the Kentucky Derby. You know, going back and looking at the NBC footage, it was really interesting to hear Baffert say, look, why I can be so calm right now is because it's really up to Mike Smith. If we break, we got a great shot. If we don't break, we lose. And that really is what the Kentucky Derby has become, is just that break is so important.
Well, he was the best horse in the race, John. So looking at the break here, what I find interesting first before we go to justify is the last 2 years, the inside where you don't want to be has been relatively clear. It's the outer 10 horses where there's been drama. I remember last year with, Classic Empire and Tapper getting wiped out at the beginning. Same thing here. When Magnum Moon really had an aggressive beginning, veering in left, he took out Mendelssohn, the 2 exchange bumps all the way to the first turn there, and to me, both of their chances to win this Kentucky Derby were wiped out, and there were some others that got caught up in that. I mean, Enticed was caught up in that a little bit. Vino Rosso breaking a little sluggishly and having that happen in front of him. Johnny V had to sort of take him back, navigate wide. He was totally out of the race, wasn't where they wanted to be. So to me, the outer 10 horses, particularly, the 14 gate out, those horses, or maybe even the 12 gate out, I think Entice was, I saw significant trouble there. And again, you can go back to last year, it was the same thing. I remember back when people used to want to be in, the first stall, the auxiliary gate, or the last stall, the main gate, 14 and 15, because you have the extra feet of, insurance for your horse to break and not get sideswiped immediately. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, we've seen that be a detriment to those horses in this race. So to me, that was a huge storyline. There were a lot of horses that lost their opportunity to win this Derby, track condition aside, before they even hit that first turn.
Well, mentioning the track conditions, I mean, it was well documented, the wettest Derby ever. I can tell you, being down there on the rail and walking that track and just being a part of, it just was raining all day. And then that track just, it really did. It felt like peanut butter. I think some horses skipped across it. I think other horses, it was just really deep trudging. And I think Bolt d'Oro was one of those horses that the track just really tired him out, whereas Justified, to me, looked like he skipped across it. What was your take?
Well, it's a clay-based track, so it handles water pretty well. When they seal it, it usually has a good firm base to it. It's not a splashy type of sloppy, the track's not washing away per se. But it does get typey, John. I mean, we saw that in the Pat Day Mile. To me, the last dirt race before the Derby, right? Obviously, the wood race, the turf race in between. But you saw the jockeys break out of there, and most of them went to the crown of the track.
Yeah.
It was clear they felt like you wanted to be on the crown of the track. Maybe the rail was washed out. That's where they felt the best footing was. Well, turned out they were wrong. Funny Duck at 39-1 comes up the rail, wins comfortably. New York Central comes up the rail at 31-1 and runs a clear second in here. And you look at the horses that were out in the crown of the track, the Restoring Hopes and Mask and Madison's Luna and, a lot of horses that were really well met. Sporting Chance, another one, did not run their race out there. And if you look at other horses that are on the rail look at National Flag, one of your favorites in the race, coming in the race looking fantastic. Doesn't break well, but drops over to the rail. He doesn't run a step. Now, who knows what may have happened to him in there, but that just shows you that how typey it is from, lane to lane. And some horses are going to, I think, National Flag had like a huge wet track number. I mean, one of the best in the race. He figured he would relish an off track. He clearly did not like it that day, and clearly, just watching the jockey strategy on the dirt when it got really wet at the end of the day, you could tell that everybody was trying to figure out the best part of that racetrack. And it turned out, it wound up being the inside, in my opinion, when you saw the results of the Pat Day Mile. And when you look at Justify, again, it's what we thought. He needed to break out of the gate. Like you mentioned, it's a big horse. What was going to make or break his race. We already knew he already won on a sloppy track. Baffert's already talked about how much the horse liked an off track. So he figured to move up there. The key for him was, I think, Mike Smith, using a tactical advantage in the race, and maybe some of the other horses, particularly Bolt d'Oro, that just clearly were not handling that surface. I think that was a huge advantage. And you also didn't really see anybody go after him, like we mentioned. I think a lot of people were more reserved in maybe their strategy, and because I think you really didn't know what to make of the wet track. It was hard to get a gauge on, okay, we're going fast, but the track is tight, justifies getting over the top of it. When do we need to go get him? Turns out he got a pretty comfortable trip for his standards, and he won as the best racehorse.
You know, it's interesting. You talk a lot about being a handicapper. You visually look at these horses as they're going into the race. It was so hard to really get a read on any of the horses, but what I can tell you, when Mike Smith and Justify went by, when I'm on the rail, they were calm. They had a calm presence to them. Justify got a little worked up with some photographers and let them know, hey, you're getting a little close to me. But that was really all that worked him up. But Mike Smith's eye just looked so determined. A lot of the other people that came through, they just kind of had this worried look. Like, I think the conditions got in their head. I think some of the jockeys, when I saw Ryan Moore come by on Mendelssohn, he just looked like this is crazy. And talking with a lot of the international people that have reached out to us, you know, they were saying to us, I'm surprised you guys didn't like cancel the Derby, you know? Was it ever in doubt? And I said, no, there was no lightning, it was just rain. So much of the world was so surprised that we ran on that surface. I just think that it did mess with some of the jockeys and just kind of mess with their psyche a little bit.
And who would have thought last week when we were talking about the Derby, and we talked about, you know, the normal factors of the race aside from the actual running of the race, you know, in terms of the post positions, in terms of the weather. We didn't even bring up the weather because I'm watching the forecast from 10 days out, and everybody's talking about, oh, we might get some rain, a line of rain during Oaks Day could affect that day.
Right.
It's not going to affect Derby Day. Everybody across the board was saying that. And then Thursday, it sort of crept in a little bit. Friday, it was still a small chance, but under 50%. Nobody really thought until maybe the end of Friday that it could be a factor. And it doesn't rain a drop on Oaks Day that I can remember being there. Derby Day is a complete washout. So go figure, Kentucky in the spring. We didn't think weather was going to be a storyline. It wound up being one of the biggest storylines in this race because I think clearly, John, I think it helped Justify. It moved him up a little bit. Not that he needed a lot of help.
Right.
I do think it helped him a little bit, and I do think it probably hurt some of the other horses' chances. Now, Bolt d'Oro, not to make too many excuses for the horse, you know, he's a horse that clearly was not handling to me because Victor was having to tap him on the shoulder a half mile into the race. And just watching his head carriage, he was climbing a little bit at parts of the race. I don't think he handled it. He had a pedigree for it, but he'd never experienced it on the road. So there are going to be a lot of people in the camp that says, well, Bolt d'Oro, he had 2 tough races coming in. He's over the top. That's why he didn't run well. I'm still in the camp that he was not handling that racetrack at all. Justify obviously loved it. And he draws away from Good Magic, who I thought fired a big race.
Yeah.
Another huge wet track number, Son of Curlin. Got a great trip on the inside. I think he wanted to be forwardly placed. Same thing with Audible. I mean, he carved out a great trip from the 5-hole. The inside was not an issue. You wanted to be on the inside, and he finished up and ran back to the numbers that he had showed down in Florida too. So I definitely think a very credible finish with the top 3 finishers. Unfortunately, I do think it hindered some of the chances, some of the long shots in here. And let me talk about one horse real quick.
Okay.
Instilled Regard, who you just saw rally for 4th there. He had to wait pretty significantly at the top of the stretch for a seam to open. Meanwhile, Audible gets up on the inside. I think you could make a good case in here that Instilled Regard could have run, you know, on the board in this race, potentially even second if he gets a clean trip. Now, that's all part of rallying in the Derby, right? That's why horses like Justify have such an edge. If you're a good horse, you can control things. You have such a big advantage in this race. Instilled Regard obviously wasn't able to do that. My Boy Jack finishing up well in here, wasn't able to control his pace. My Boy Jack obviously loves the sloppy track. I think it's fair to say Instilled Regard does as well, but that's at least the Instilled Regard that we had hoped that we would see. He's a horse that I never thought was as good in California. To me, he showed up in here in a big way and showed that he could be one of the top players in this division.
Yeah, it was interesting because he was a horse that a lot of people were saying really didn't even belong in the race, just came in on points, which starts a whole nother conversation about, you know, is 20 horses too many horses in the Kentucky Derby? When you see what's happening each year, you got 5 or 6 of them who just get taken out of the race before they even get a chance. I think this year it's resurfaced because of Mendelssohn, just to be frank.
Sure.
I think he was a horse that if he would have got a little better position, if he could break like we talked about, and even his trainer, Aidan O'Brien, said in there, look, we came in, we were ill prepared. Our horses need to learn how to break better because it's paramount in the Derby. You have to break or you don't even have a chance. So I think you're going to see Coolmore with a little different strategy. I bet you they'll have a gate there in Ireland, and you'll start seeing these horses doing a lot more gate work before they come over here.
He basically admitted everything that we were worried about with Mendelssohn going in. You know, the style of racing in America, particularly when you add dirt, the sloppy track is a factor. I mean, the gate is so important. Now, he didn't break horrible. Look, what happened to him could happen to anybody. Magnum Moon came over and sideswiped him, and the two just kept exchanging bumps and sideswiping each other the entire way down the first cross by the finish wire. So they were taken out early. He was a victim of bad luck more than anything. But to your point, if he's a sharper gate horse, like a Justify, and he can hit 3 jumps and get in the clear, potentially he gets sideswiped. His momentum's still going to carry him away from the minutiae, where you saw those horses really come together. Hurt Vino Rosso, he broke just a tap slow. Johnny couldn't get him in the race in time. By that time, they were coming together in front of him. He had to wait, come around. He was out of the race. So, you know, that's just bad luck more than anything. But that was a concern of why Mendelssohn, for us, at least in my opinion, really felt like he was up against it in this race. Talent aside, we know he's a great talent. But one thing I want to talk about that you mentioned, you know, with the point system in the Derby, they'll always go 20 horses because that's where Churchill Downs makes their bottom line for the year. You want 20 variables to have a mainstream betting attraction to be able to, you know, have the healthy odds that the big money's going to come in and really get into these pools that make their bottom line for the year. So I don't ever see that changing. But the point system, I will say, is doing its job, in my opinion. It's getting those greatest stakes 2-year-old sprint money out. And what you've seen since they changed to the point system in the last 6 years, John, are 6 favorites win the Derby. Now you will ask, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's a good thing because it still shows that, I think anytime it shows the integrity of the race, you know, with it being formful like that, I think is a positive thing in my opinion. And the one thing other than Orb, the last 5 Derby winners have all been tactical horses. So what does that tell you? That pace has not been a factor in this in terms of melting down. Justify and all the California Crown, I mean, you go back the last 5 years, the last 5 favorites to win the Derby were all tactical horses that were forwardly placed in the race, and it's what we talked about. The pace is not melting down these Derbies anymore. If you're a horse like Instilled Regard, if you're a horse like Mendelssohn that can't get positioned early, if you're a horse like that has to rely on the Exaggerator, we saw it with him, trying to pass a bunch of horses and win this type of race now, I think you're up against it as opposed in the past where you may have had, if you still needed racing luck, but you may have had more of a legitimate shot with the pace. Now it's showing that the tactical horse, there's not these meltdown paces, the track's fast. Yeah, Justify ran a half in 45 and change. Big deal, the track was sealed for a horse like him. It didn't matter. Good Magic's a couple lengths off of him and still ran second. You know, Audible rallied up the rail. So I make that point to say the point system I think is doing its job.
I think so.
And I think you want a tactical horse now in the Derby, and so many people make so much of the pace. I don't think it's really a storyline now.
Well, it's interesting you say that the last 5 Derbies were won by the favorite. The last 4 Derby winners for Bob have gone on to win the Preakness. So now he's got Justify, who looks like he's the best horse of this crop. Storyline comes out this week. It's obvious. Everybody saw the video. You know, first it was scratches. Now it's a bruised hoof. I think it makes more sense that it's a bruised hoof. I don't blame Bob. Look, he's brought a horse out there to show the media, look, here's your Derby winner. And he's just a little bit sore on there when he turns to the left. It's going to be interesting now because everybody's looking and saying, hey, is our Derby champ okay? Is he going to be okay for the Preakness? Which is kind of a domino effect of the whole Preakness. So now we transition from Derby to Preakness and everyone's waiting. Is Justify going to run? Tell me, what do you think about the Preakness and do you think that Justify will be in there?
Well, Bob basically has a perfect record going from the Derby to the Preakness. So you take a horse like this that was well meant. I mean, he's not the War Emblem that won the Derby at 20 to 1. I mean, this horse was, and that's not taking anything away from War Emblem, but Justify's the fastest horse of this crop as well. So you would expect coming back in 2 weeks, Bob has this down. The horse is going to be 1 to 5 in the race, and to me, you would expect him to, you know, go into the Belmont Stakes with a shot of winning the Triple Crown. You would expect him to win the Preakness. The one hindrance is that bruised foot, John, the 3/4 shoe that is on. He's a big horse. He's a heavy horse. Obviously a very fast horse. There's a lot of torque there with him pushing off in that hind end. We'll see what happens. You know, no foot, no horse. It's the same adage. You know, they've obviously, you know, I'm not sure how fresh this is. They've obviously managed this horse who didn't come around and race till he was 3. So we know that there's some past, you know, things that they've had to work through. Bob's a master. I would expect him to get him to the race okay, but it's worth following because, again, the foot's such an important thing with a horse that, you know, we're going to have to see what Bob decides to do with him. Is he going to breeze this weekend, or is he just going to gallop up to the race, train up to the race, as opposed to have a workout? All worth, you know, putting him under the microscope, in my opinion, over the course of the next week to see exactly what we're dealing with coming to the Preakness. Because if he shows up and he runs anything close to his A race, we're going to Belmont in a few weeks looking for maybe a Triple Crown winner.
You know, it's interesting. Both horses came back. Bolt d'Oro came back today. Justify came back. They both galloped. We're shooting a show on Thursday. You know, Bolt's at Keeneland, which everybody thought he shipped back to California and that he was going to wait and run in the Pacific Classic.
Yeah.
They changed. They've been at Keeneland. They've been jogging. Today was his first gallop back. The horse looks great. I think he's got, you know, condition-wise, his gallop looked great. And I hear the same thing for Justify at Churchill. Obviously, we went to Keeneland and watched Bolt. We couldn't be in both places. But from what I hear and what I see on Twitter, it looks like that Justify had the same kind of gallop. Both horses look like they're okay. And I think the Preakness is still on the table for Bolt d'Oro, where we all thought it was kind of off. Show me the TCI top 10 and who you think is going to be in this year's Preakness.
Well, we're going to include Bolt d'Oro on the list because of his possibility of running in the Preakness Stakes, John. I still feel like, poor performance aside, I don't think he wanted to maybe track that close, particularly when he was spinning his wheels over that track. Looks to come out of the race well. I still view him as a top 3 horse of his crop. Whether or not he can beat Justify on fair terms is a huge concern. They've run against each other to where the last 2 times I do feel like Justify had an edge with the pace advantage in Santa Anita Derby, and certainly him loving the racetrack more so than Bolt d'Oro, in my opinion, not handling it in the Kentucky Derby. So we'll see if that you know, the third match materializes next week in the Preakness Stakes. But realistically, I look in here and I say, well, who can beat Justify if he fires his race? And to me, the only horse that has form that suggests that they could run with him in the stretch, in my opinion, is Bolt d'Oro. I mean, Good Magic fired, in my opinion. He had his opportunity to close the gap, wasn't able to do that. So now you take a barn, Chad Brown likes to, you know, run with, you know, good 5-6 weeks rest and really hasn't had a lot of success. Again, we talked about the Pletcher factor and turning a horse around. We know he's a smaller physical type horse. He's in great form right now, but he ran well. So now you're bringing him, putting him on the road, running him back in 2 weeks. Potentially, he's not the kind of horse that I think is going to move forward and beat Justify and close that gap in 2 weeks. Quip. You know, again, we saw Magnum Moon run away from him in the Arkansas Derby. Very nice horse in here. Can he run with Justify? No. Now, could he hurt Justify with his speed? That's the interesting dynamic.
Yeah,
they're both WinStar horses. You know, how are they going to manage this race next weekend with 2 free-running type horses that want to be forwardly placed in here and trying to manage that pace when they own both horses? Very interesting point in here. But, you know, I look at that top 5 in my TCI top 10, John. To me, your winner's likely going to come out of this. Sporting Chance, again, has been through the grinder. I thought he ran a very sneaky good race in the Pat Day Mile, despite a very tough trip in there. In my opinion, he was very wide in there, and that track was a little odd. But, again, you know, here's a horse that it's going to be a big long shot if he runs in the Preakness. And I just think there's enough quality there for D. Wayne Lucas that you could look up and see him hit the board at a big number. Now, can he beat Justify? That's obviously very unlikely. You
know, for all the Justify fans and to really kind of set it up, Mike Smith was quoted as saying, look, we haven't even seen the best of this horse yet. So, I mean, that's scary to think what he did in the Santa Anita Derby, what he came back and did in the Kentucky Derby, and Mike's saying, look, I haven't even gotten to the bottom of this horse. So
much for the Apollo curse, right?
Right, that's over now. And you know,
it just shows you, John, we're going to break all these trends. I mean, it's Bob Baffert. Did anybody really think that he worried about the Apollo curse? But I will say this horse had everything go perfect for them. Remember, we were talking about him when he broke his maiden. I mean, at the time, they got that allowance race written for him. There's a chance he was going to maybe come in for the Rebel, the ship him to Oakland. They decide to run him that allowance race. He wins easily, so that's now first 2-turn race under his belt, 2 starts, so he kind of checks that box. So then they're saying, okay, well, maybe 1 more start in the Sunland Derby. Remember, that was on the table. And with everything that wound up happening, you know, they wind up, you know, with the schedule they have, perfectly spaced out races. He didn't really have a hard race till he had to face Bolt d'Oro, and he had an easy time of it, being that he was on the lead going a mile and 1/8, and then to come into this race, I mean, everything just worked out for him. They never had to take him on the road, fly him around. They were able to lead him up out of his own stall until he came to the week of the Kentucky Derby. So kudos to those guys. I think a little of that's luck, a lot of that's the horse, and obviously the schedule worked out for him.
All right, thank you, Joel. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure you come back next week. We'll know who's going to be in the Preakness, and we'll let you know who we think will win this year's Preakness.